grace in the face of sorrow. William and Kate's quiet farewell that moved a nation. The morning of September 8th, 2022, began like any other in most homes across Britain. People woke up, made their tea, switched on the radio, checked their phones. Children were dropped at school. Trains ran on time. The country TBH'd, hummed along in its ordinary rhythm, unaware that by the afternoon, nothing would feel ordinary at all. And actually, Balmoral Castle, perched in the cold hills of Scotland, to the woman who had held the nation together for 70 years, was dying. Queen Elizabeth II, aged 96, Britain's longest reigning monarch, was slipping away. Her family had been summoned. The doctors had made clear that her condition was serious. By early, evening, the announcement came. Short, official, impossible to argue with. The Queen had died peacefully at Balmoral Castle. The flags across the country were lowered. The world stopped moving for a moment. And for what it's worth, then it started crying. For you know, Prince William, the news was both expected and devastating in the way that only the death of someone deeply loved can be. He had known this day would come. Plus, everyone TBH had known. In the quiet way you know something you don't dare put into words. His grandmother had been slowing down. She had missed events she would once never have missed. The cane had appeared. The careful management of her appearances had become more visible. But knowing something is coming does not protect you from the weight of it when it finally arrives. It landed on him like something physical. He wasn't just losing a grandmother. He was losing the woman who had sat at the head of his world for his entire life, who had been the anchor of a family that often needed one, who had, in her quiet and steady way, been a constant in every room he had ever stood in. Kate, the Princess of Wales, had her own grief to carry. She had come, in my opinion, into the royal family as a young woman, watched carefully by the public and by the institution, and the Queen had been a guiding presence through it all. There had been basically moments between them that never made the newspapers, small kindnesses, honestly, unspoken acknowledgments. Plus, the way the Queen had welcomed her, not with fanfare, but with the kind of genuine warmth that meant more precisely because it was quiet. Kate had learned what it meant to be royal by watching a woman who had spent 7 decades perfecting the balance between duty and humanity, between the weight of the crown and the love of her family. Losing her wasn't simply losing a monarch, it was losing a teacher, which a reassurance. The days that followed existed in a kind of haze that settled over the entire country. And people who had never met the Queen stood in queues that stretched for miles, sometimes 12 hours or more, to walk past her coffin as she lay in state at Westminster Hall. They came in suits and in trainers, in school uniforms, and in their best coats. Elderly men and women who remembered her coronation. Young people who had grown up knowing no other monarch. They cried openly, which was remarkable for a country not known for public displays of emotion. They left, I guess, on flowers outside Buckingham Palace until the lawn disappeared under a carpet of color. They gathered in parks and on pavements, not quite sure what they were looking for, but needing to be near something, near others, in the way that grief makes people want to stop being alone. William and TBH, Kate moved through this period with care and intention. The world was watching them in a different way now. The Queen's death had made William the Prince of Wales officially, and had placed him one step closer to a future he had always known was coming, but which now felt very real and very close. He was no longer simply the heir's heir. He was, to be fair, the heir, which, and Kate, who had spent years preparing without ever quite knowing when the preparation would end, was now the Princess of Wales, a title that carried enormous weight in the public imagination because of the woman who had held it before her. Diana's shadow, in my opinion, was never far. It never would be. Plus, they made a decision in those early days of mourning that said everything about who they were. Rather than retreat entirely into the privacy of grief, they stepped out. They went to Windsor, walked among the crowds who had gathered there, stood close to strangers who had traveled hours to be near the grief they shared. William shook hands and spoke quietly. Kate bent down to speak to children, took flowers from people, who pressed them forward with shaking hands. So there were no speeches. There were no carefully crafted statements. Plus, just two people moving through sorrow in public, choosing presence over distance, choosing people over protocol. It was a child who broke William, not in a dramatic way, not with tears spilling openly down his face, just in the way that something true and unexpected can cut through even the most carefully held composure. A little girl stepped forward from the crowd at Windsor and handed him a card she had drawn herself. I inside it, in the crooked handwriting of a child who hadn't yet learned to keep her letters neat. She had written that she was sorry about his grandmother. That was all, that she was sorry about his grandmother. He stood well, there for a moment with the card in his hands. He looked at it the way people look at things that are too simple to be defended against. He thanked her, which he moved on. But those who were watching said the moment stayed in the air long after he had walked away. What the country was beginning to understand, in those strange suspended days between the death and the funeral, was that William and Kate were not performing grief. They were in it. There is a difference, and people can feel the difference, even if they cannot always name it. Performance has a smoothness to it, a managed quality, a sense that someone has rehearsed the expression on their face. What William and Kate showed, in those days, was none of that. They were composed, yes, because composure is what had been asked of them, by their position, and by their own sense of what was needed. But underneath the composure was something real and unguarded. It showed in the moments between the public moments, in the way William stood next to his father, close but not quite touching, both of them carrying something too large for words. In the way Kate held herself, straight and steady, but with a softness around the eyes that gave away what steadiness was costing her. The country was in a strange emotional state. Britain isn't a nation that wears its feelings easily. There is a cultural pride in stoicism, in getting on with things, in not making a fuss. And yet the death of the Queen had undone something in the collective chest of the nation. People were weeping on the street. Strangers were hugging each other. Radio presenters were breaking mid-sentence. Something had been loosened. Something that, that had been held very tightly for a very long time, had given way. And in the middle of all of it, William and Kate stood as a kind of permission. If they could grieve openly, if they could let the country see the weight they were carrying, then perhaps the rest of the nation could too. The children, pretty much, were a quiet concern behind the scenes. George, 9 years old, Charlotte, 7, and little Louis, who had only just turned 4, were old enough to understand that something enormous had happened, but young enough for their parents to still be able to shield them from the full force of it. William and Kate had always been fiercely protective of their children's private lives, determined to give them as ordinary a childhood as could be managed inside the extraordinary circus of being born royal. Now that determination took on new weight, and they talked to the children honestly, age-appropriately. They explained as much as could be explained to small people who were still learning what the world was. Kate, whose instinct toward her children was almost cellular in its protectiveness, made sure that even in the middle of everything else, George and Charlotte and Louis felt seen and held. There were moments, later reconstructed by people who had been nearby, that revealed what was happening in the quieter spaces. William had told someone at a small gathering that he still caught himself, at odd moments, in a sudden wave of sadness, that he would be doing something entirely ordinary, and then the grief would arrive without warning, the way grief does, unannounced and indifferent to timing. He wasn't saying this dramatically, which he was saying it the way people say true things when they have stopped trying to manage the impression they're making. Plainly. As fact. The flowers kept piling up outside the palace. The queues kept forming. The nation kept vigil in the way nations do, on imperfectly and collectively, gathering in the cold to feel less alone in something enormous. And through it all, William and Kate kept showing up. Not because they had no choice, though duty was part of it, but because they understood, in a way that perhaps surprised even them, that their presence was doing something for people that they couldn't easily explain. They, I think, were proof that it was possible to hold sorrow and not be destroyed by it. They were walking, invisible proof that grief and dignity were not opposites, that you could be broken and still stand. The coffin arrived at Westminster Hall on September 14th, drawn through the streets on a naval gun carriage, pulled by 98 sailors, the same way the carriage had been pulled at the funeral of Winston Churchill more than half a century before. The bells of Big Ben tolled, at 1-minute intervals. The streets were, lined with hundreds of thousands of people who had come to watch in silence. The sound of the crowd wasn't applause, not the kind of noise a crowd usually makes. It was something softer and more complex. A held breath, released slowly, over and over, as the procession moved through the ancient streets of London toward the place where the nation would say goodbye. William walked behind the coffin in his RAF uniform, his medals catching the pale September light. He walked straight and steady. He kept his eyes forward, which beside him, in the car that carried the rest of the family, Kate sat with George and Charlotte beside her, their faces arranged in the particular composure of children who have been asked to be brave and are trying very hard to be. Charlotte wore a small diamond horseshoe brooch, a gift from the Queen. It was such a small detail, but it was the kind of detail that made the whole country breathe in sharply when they saw it, because it was love made visible in the form of a tiny piece of jewelry on a 7-year-old girl who had lost her great-grandmother and didn't yet have all the words to say so. This was the beginning of something. Plus, not just a farewell, but a transition. The country was burying a queen and discovering that the generation waiting in the wings had within them the same capacity for grace, under pressure, that had made Elizabeth II a figure of genuine love and not just institutional loyalty. And people watching that day, standing in the cold along the procession route, or crowded around television screens in living rooms, cafes and offices, were watching two people step more fully into a role that would define the rest of their lives. And what they saw in those days of gray September grief wasn't the performance of royalty. It, to be fair, was the reality of it, the weight of it, plus and the grace with which two very human people were choosing to carry it. Grace in the face of sorrow, William and Kate's quiet farewell that moved a nation. The morning of the state funeral arrived gray and still. September 19th, 2022. Plus the kind of autumn morning that London does particularly well, when the sky holds a flat, soft light that makes everything look like it is being photographed through a lens smeared with something melancholy. By 6:30 in the morning, the lying in state had ended. Westminster Hall, which had received more than 250,000 people in 4 days, was quiet again. The Queen's coffin was alone with its guards one final time before it would be carried out into the world for the last great public ceremony of her reign. London had been filling since before dawn. People had slept on pavements. They had come from Scotland and Wales, from Cornwall and from Yorkshire, Bonded from Northern Ireland and from every corner of the Commonwealth. They had come from Canada and Australia and New Zealand and Jamaica and India. Many of them had never seen the Queen in person. Many of them had spent their entire lives under her monarchy without ever once being in the same room as her. And yet, they had come. They had wrapped themselves in blankets and drunk tea from thermoses and stood in the cold dark, waiting for a procession that would last minutes, carrying a woman who had reigned for 70 years, and they'd not have been anywhere else. Just before 11 in the morning, the gun carriage bearing the Queen's coffin moved out from Westminster toward Westminster Abbey. The coffin was draped in the royal standard, and on top of it rested the imperial state crown, the orb and the scepter, those ancient objects that represent the transfer of sovereign power, that carry in their jeweled weight the whole complicated history of a monarchy that has endured through centuries of wars and revolutions and reinventions. They gleamed in the morning light. They looked, from a distance, improbably bright against all that grief. Walking behind the coffin was the king. Charles III, who had spent his entire life waiting to become king, walked with the weight of that weight visible in the set of his shoulders. Beside him and around him, the family arranged themselves as protocol required. And William, I think, was there in his RAF uniform, walking with the deliberate measured pace that military mourning demands, each step placed with precision, the kind of precision that has been drilled into soldiers and royals alike, because it leaves no room for the body to betray what the mind is working hard to contain. Westminster Abbey received nearly 2,000 people for the service. Heads of state, prime ministers, presidents, monarchs from across Europe and the world. The kind of gathering that happens only in the rarest circumstances, when someone dies who was so woven into the international fabric of things that their absence creates an immediate and felt gap. There were representatives from over 170 nations. There were people in that church who disagreed on almost everything that mattered, whose countries had complex and sometimes bitter histories with each other, when they were all there together, in the same ancient building, under the same enormous vaulted ceiling, in the same silence. The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke about the Queen's life of service. The Dean of TBH, Westminster, read from Scripture. The music chosen for the service was the music the Queen herself had loved, music. That reached TBH, back through the decades of her reign, and even further, music composed for moments of royal ceremony stretching back centuries. The Lord's My Shepherd, which had been sung at her wedding in 1947. Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, which had been sung at William and Kate's own wedding in this same abbey 11 years before. The music did what music always does at moments when words fall short. It went somewhere that language cannot reach. Kate sat in the abbey with George and Charlotte on either side of her. 9-year-old George, who one day would be king, sat very straight, and very still in the way that children sit when they're trying very hard to be what's being asked of them. He watched the service with the focused gravity of a child who understands something enormous is happening, even if he does not yet understand all of its dimensions. Charlotte, pretty much, beside her mother, had her hands folded in her lap. She had worn sort of her great-grandmother's brooch every day of the public mourning events, that small diamond horseshoe, and she wore it again now. The simplicity look of the gesture was extraordinary. She was 7 years old, and she was honoring the woman who had given her the brooch by wearing it to say goodbye. There were moments during the service when the camera would find William's face, and the country watching at home would go quiet, in the particular way that people go quiet when they see something true. He was holding himself with the composure that had been trained into him over a lifetime. That had been modeled for him by a grandmother who had made composure into a kind of art form. But composure isn't the absence of feeling, and it is feeling contained. And in the lines of his face during those quiet moments of the service, the containment was visible as effort. The country saw it and recognized it because it was what they were all doing, in their different ways, in their living rooms and in their gardens, and on the pavements of every city and town and village where people had gathered around screens to watch. The service lasted about an hour. At its conclusion, the national anthem was sung. And then the sovereign's piper, standing somewhere in the building, began to play a lament. The sound of the pipes is a sound that exists at the very edge of what can be born. It is a sound that bypasses the rational brain and goes straight to something older, something that responds to music as grief made audible. In that vast and ancient church, with the coffin of the woman who had been monarch for 70 years resting on its catafalque, the pipes played. The sound spread through the abbey and out into the gray September air, and people on the streets outside stopped and didn't speak. After the service, the procession reformed, and the coffin moved again through the streets of London toward Wellington Arch, and from there it was placed in the state hearse that would carry it to Windsor. 25 miles, and through the autumn English countryside. And along every mile of that route, people stood. They had come out of villages and towns that the procession passed through, had lined country roads, had gathered on motorway bridges to watch the hearse pass below them. Some of them held flowers. Some of them held nothing, just stood with their hands at their sides in the cold air. A farmer stood alone in a field, beside his tractor, hat removed, head bowed, as the hearse passed the edge of his land. These were not people who had been asked to come. No official had organized this part. These were just people who felt something and needed to be near it, in the ancient human way of needing to witness, of needing to mark a passing with presence. So the country was doing something that it didn't have words for, something it rarely allowed itself to do, which was simply to feel the loss of something irreplaceable without immediately moving on to the next thing. Windsor was waiting. Thousands of people lined the long walk, that great straight avenue leading from Windsor town to the castle gates, stretching for nearly 3 miles through the parkland that had been a constant in the Queen's life, and especially in her later years, when she had spent more and more of her time here. The hearse moved slowly along the long walk as people pressed forward on either side, not quite believing. The thing they were watching, not quite able to hold the scale of it in their ordinary human hands. At St. George's Chapel, the committal service began at 4 in the afternoon. This was a smaller ceremony, more intimate, though intimacy is a relative word when the building is a royal chapel and the congregation includes governors general and realm prime ministers and members of a royal family, still raw with grief. The choir of St. George's sang. The Dean of Windsor read a passage from Revelation that had also been read at the funerals of both the king's grandfather, great-grandfather, a thread of scripture running through the generations of this family's goodbyes. The reading itself became something more than words. It became continuity. Evidence that the family had stood in rooms like this before and had endured. Before the final hymn, something happened that stopped the nation. The imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter were removed from the coffin and placed on the altar. The objects that had crowned her, that she had carried through her coronation, and on through all the state openings of Parliament, and all the grand ceremonies of her reign, were separated from her. The crown left her coffin and rested on the altar of the chapel, and the message of the gesture was wordless and complete. The reign was over. The symbols for what it's worth of sovereignty were already moving to the next generation. King Charles placed the Queen's Company camp color of the Grenadier Guards upon the coffin with his own hands. The Lord Chamberlain broke his wand of office and laid it there, too. These were ancient rites, gestures that hadn't been performed in public since the funeral of George VI in 1952. The country watching was aware, dimly or sharply, depending on each person, that they were watching something they'd never see again. The Garter King of Arms pronounced the Queen's styles and titles in the formal, ancient way that these things are pronounced in the presence of royalty. The list of her titles, accumulated over a reign of 7 decades, was long. It, I guess, filled the chapel, and it described the dimensions of a life given to something much larger than a single person. The coffin was lowered into the royal vault. The sovereign's piper played a lament, and then he walked away down the aisle until the sound of the pipes faded and was gone, which was said to represent the departure of the soul. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. William actually stood through all of this with his children beside him, with Kate beside them both, and what the cameras caught in those final moments of the committal was something that would be remembered long after the specific details of the day were blurred by time. He was a man in the middle of a loss, in the middle of a transition, standing in the chapel of a castle that had been his grandmother's home, about to walk out of a service that had just placed the full weight of what was coming next squarely on his shoulders. And he was well, upright. He was there. He was present in a way that went beyond obligation and into something more fundamental. He was showing his children how to stand in the hard moments. He was showing the country how to carry something without being broken by it. Outside, in the Windsor parkland, people stood and waited in the cooling afternoon air. They had been there since morning. Some of them had been there since the night before. They waited because, for what it's worth, waiting was the only thing they could offer, the only way they had of being part of this day. When the service ended and the family emerged from the chapel, there were no speeches made to the crowd, no formal acknowledgement of the people standing in the cold along the long walk. There didn't need to be. The presence of the family, visible and human and real, was its own form of communication. The nation had shown up for the Queen, and the family had shown up for the nation. That exchange, and sort of, simple as it sounds, was what held the whole country together in that strange suspended time between one era and the next. What stayed with people after the cameras had gone and the crowd had dispersed and the extraordinary September had finally become October wasn't any single grand gesture or memorable speech. It was the accumulation of small, true things. The card from the child at Windsor, the brooch on Charlotte's coat, the way William walked behind the coffin, the way Kate held her children's hands, the way the family had turned toward the country, in its grief rather than away from it, had allowed themselves to be seen in their sorrow, had trusted the people who were watching with the truth of what those days were costing them. It wasn't a performance of royalty in the old, distant sense. It was royalty as something human and recognizable. And the nation, which had been holding its breath for 11 days, exhaled. Grace in the face of sorrow. William. Kate's quiet. Farewell that moved a nation. The day after the funeral, Britain woke up different. Not completely different. Not in the way that some shifts announce themselves loudly and demand to be acknowledged, but different in basically the quiet way that a room feels different after the person who filled it has left. The black bunting was still up, plus the flowers were still piled outside the palace gates, beginning now to soften at the edges in the September rain. But something had moved from anticipation to aftermath, from the held breath of waiting to the long exhale of reckoning with what had actually happened. The Queen was gone. The new king was on the throne. And the people who had watched William and Kate move through those 11 days of public grief were left with something. That took, time to name properly, but that they felt clearly. An attachment. A recognition, I mean. Sock had a sense that those two people, the Prince and Princess of Wales, had shown them something real. It matters in the life of a country to have people in positions of visibility who are willing to be genuinely human in the moments when human feeling is the most needed thing. Britain has a complicated relationship with its monarchy. There are people who love it with a loyalty that runs deep and unexamined, who feel the royal family as part of the national identity in a way that goes beyond politics or logic. There are people who find the whole institution archaic and difficult to justify in a modern democracy, who bristle at the deference and the cost and the spectacle. And there's the vast middle, the majority, who hold something more complicated and more honest, who can see the institution's contradictions clearly and still find themselves moved by the sight of a young family walking through collective grief with their dignity intact and their hearts visibly cracked open. William and Kate came back to public duties carefully and in stages. The mourning period required a pause, a stepping back from the ordinary schedule of engagements and appearances. But by late September, so less than 2 weeks after the funeral, they traveled to Windsor to meet the volunteers and staff who had made the committal service possible. It was a quiet engagement. There actually were no television cameras set up for formal footage. There were no grand speeches. They simply went, and they spoke to people. And William said, in the plain way that had become more natural to him in those weeks, that he still got caught sometimes by moments of sadness that arrived without warning. He said, TBH, on this to strangers. He said it as fact, and not as confession, not as performance of vulnerability, but as ordinary truth. I think grief is like that. It catches you. Plus, Kate moved through these weeks with a grace that was becoming harder and harder to describe as anything other than remarkable. Not because it was effortless, but precisely because it wasn't. It cost something visible. The grace was earned. She had always been good at the public-facing part of royal duty, but yet the genuine warmth in the handshakes and the conversations that didn't feel performed, at the ability to make the person in front of her feel for a moment like the only person in the room. But these weeks asked something more than that. These weeks asked her to be in genuine grief and in public service simultaneously, to carry her own loss and the loss of a nation at the same time, without losing the distinction between the two. She did it, and it showed in her face. Sino and the country watched, and felt something that went beyond admiration into something more like recognition. Like seeing yourself reflected back more clearly than you expected. The transition of power that the Queen's death had set in motion was real and enormous and ongoing. Charles was king, and William was the Prince of Wales, the new heir apparent, a title that had been his great-grandmother's idea, of a future for him since he was old enough to understand what it meant. And with those titles came a new weight, a new visibility, a new set of expectations that were different in kind from anything that had come before. People look at the Prince of Wales differently from how they look at a more distant heir. The next generation is always theoretical until it isn't. Now it was real. The throne was one life away. William was no longer the prince in waiting behind the prince in waiting. He was next. What this meant for him privately was something only he could fully know. What it meant publicly was visible in the way he carried himself in those months following the Queen's death. There was a, steadiness to him that hadn't always been there in earlier years, when the scrutiny had sometimes made him defensive, when the pressure had sometimes made him withdraw. The public had seen glimpses of his struggle with the weight of his position over the years. He had spoken honestly, in ways that felt genuinely candid rather than carefully managed, about the difficulty of growing up in the relentless spotlight that the death of his mother had made inescapable. Diana's death in 1997 had cracked something in William that he had spent decades learning to live with, learning to carry without being destroyed by it. He had talked about the years when grief was simply not spoken about when. The loss wasn't given proper space, when he had pushed it down and kept going. And he had talked about eventually finding ways to open what had been closed. The mental health work he had done publicly, the conversations he had tried to start about men and grief and the cost of silence, had come from a deeply personal place. Now, in September 2022, he was walking through public grief again. A different grief, an older loss, a death that came at the natural end of a long life, rather than suddenly and violently in a Paris tunnel at midnight. But grief is grief. It has its own logic regardless of the circumstances that produce it. And people watching William in those weeks could see, if they were paying attention, a man who had done some work on himself, who had learned something about how to be in sorrow without being swallowed by it. The composure wasn't suppression, it was integration. There is a difference, and it matters. Kate had her own relationship with the Queen that the public only partially understood. The narrative around her joining the royal family had, in its early years, focused on the scrutiny she faced, the waiting, the long years of being William's girlfriend before becoming his wife, the nickname that made her cringe and that the press used without mercy. She had endured it with a patience that some people found extraordinary and others found simply necessary, given her circumstances. The Queen had been important to her navigation of all of that, not in the way of dramatic intervention, but in the quieter way of example and occasional counsel. The Queen knew better than anyone what it was to have the world watching your every expression, your every outfit, your every word, for signs of something it could use. She had lived that for 70 years and had done so without losing herself. That was the template. That was what Kate had been watching and learning from. The friendship between Kate and Queen Elizabeth had been one of those royal relationships that the public caught in glimpses and filled in with speculation. What was known was real enough. The Queen had given Kate significant signals of trust and confidence, had included her in engagements and in moments that communicated clearly that she was valued, not merely tolerated. In the last years of the Queen's life, when Elizabeth had been slowing down and the weight of public duties had been gradually shifted to the younger generations, Kate had taken on more and done so in a way that earned her genuinely wide affection. She had the TBH, rare ability to be present in a room without dominating it, to make service look natural rather than obligatory, to find the human detail in every public engagement that made it feel like something other than ceremony. The letter William, to be fair, wrote, in those weeks of mourning, to a woman whose husband had died. A pizza van owner from Wales who had met William and Kate in a brief, warm encounter while the princess was already quietly undergoing cancer treatment. The husband had, I think, died, and William had written to the widow on official Kensington Palace paper to say that he and Catherine were terribly sorry, that they could only begin to imagine the hole the loss would leave. It was a private letter. It wasn't written for public consumption or public credit. It became known because the widow, moved by the gesture, spoke about it. She pretty much said the letter from William and Kate was very special, that it had meant something particular because of what they themselves were going through, because it must have resonated with people who understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to watch someone you loved face something enormous and uncertain. This was the thing about William and Kate that the mourning period had made more visible than ever before. Their compassion wasn't the performative kind that consists of showing up for a photo and moving on. It was actually the kind that persisted in private, that wrote letters when no one was watching. That drove real attention toward the real grief of ordinary people, even when the royal family itself was deep in its own grief. People in Britain and beyond felt this. They felt the difference between being a symbol of something and actually caring about the people the symbol was supposed to represent. The children started school nearby at Lambrook, and George and Charlotte, newly returned from the strange and enormous autumn they had worked through, sat down in classrooms and began the work of ordinary life again. This was intentional. But William and Kate had always been fiercely clear about wanting their children to have as normal a childhood as the circumstances of their birth would allow. And they had held that line with a consistency that was remarkable given the pressures working against it. Now, for what it's worth, with the monarchy in transition and the family in genuine grief and the whole country watching, the work of protecting those three children's ordinary lives continued. The school run, the homework, some which the dinners at home, the stuff that has nothing to do with royal duty and everything to do with being parents. There was something instructive in this for the nation. William and Kate, even in the middle of all of it, were first and most fundamentally a family. Parents, partners, people who worried about whether their children were sleeping enough and eating their vegetables and understanding what was happening to their world. The scale of the public grief around them was enormous, but the private scale of what they were managing inside their household was very human and very recognizable. And the way they managed it, openly enough to let the country feel connected to them, but privately enough to protect what needed protecting, spoke to a kind of emotional intelligence that the country was coming to rely on as it thought about what the monarchy might be in the years ahead. Months passed. The country found its way back to ordinary time. The flowers outside the palace were eventually collected and composted and returned to the ground. The black bunting came down, the endless television coverage, the rolling analysis, the archive footage, the tributes and countdowns and commemorations gave way to the next thing and the thing after that. But something had settled in people's understanding of William and Kate during those weeks that would not easily shift. Not an idealization. The country had been through enough with its royals to be past idealization. Something more durable than that. For what it's worth, a trust. A sense that these two people, who had come through so much and still had so much ahead of them, understood the job in a way that went deeper than ceremony. That they took it personally. That they felt it. That when the country needed someone to stand in the grief with them and not blink, they had stood there. That is no small thing. In a world that is often short on sincerity and long on spectacle, the ability to be genuinely present in a moment of public sorrow, to let it land, to carry it openly without either performing it or hiding it, is a kind of grace that is harder to manufacture than it looks. William and Kate hadn't manufactured it. They had arrived at it through the particular school of their lives, through loss and scrutiny and the hard work of becoming more than the titles they were given at birth. The nation had watched them become it. The nation had watched them stand in the gray September light, two people in love with each other and raw with grief. Still showing pretty much up, and had felt something that cut through all the complexity of modern Britain's relationship with its monarchy and landed somewhere much simpler and much older. The feeling of being witnessed, the feeling of being accompanied, the feeling that even in the worst kinds of loss, you are not entirely alone. The Queen had given her whole life to that idea. She had dedicated herself to a kind of presence and service that asked everything and returned the dedication of a nation. In those September days, watching her grandson and his wife walk through the farewell with their chins up and their hearts open, Britain could see the inheritance clearly. Not the titles. To be fair, not the palaces. Not the weight of the crown waiting on the altar. The inheritance that honestly mattered was this: knowing that showing up, being present, choosing people over distance, isn't a weakness in a leader, but the whole of the point. Elizabeth II had known it for 70 years. And watching, William and Kate move through those gray and grieving September days, it was clear they knew it too.